Hey Bag Lady, I'm Sarah Lawson from So Sweetness. Thanks so much for joining me for Ask Sarah, my weekly Q&A chat. Thanks so much for joining me tonight. I'm super excited about my special guest. I just saw everybody filing in on YouTube and Facebook. I saw Pamela and Lawanda. I see Diane and Priscilla just jumped in. So thanks so much everybody for joining me. So I'm super excited. My special guest tonight is CPA Nathan Owen. And the reason that I wanted to have a CPA slash accountant on my chat is that I know that a lot of people that use my sewing patterns make and sell bags or other items to sell at craft fairs or online. And I also know that some people take custom orders from coworkers at their workplace, again, for bags or quilts. And that might mean you're getting ready to start a business, or maybe you have already started a business but need a little guidance. So when I first started my business selling sewing patterns, I admit my books were a disaster. I'm not a numbers person. I'm not good at math. And so when the topic of bookkeeping or taxes or accountants came up, I just wanted to cover my ears and sort of bury my head in the sand. But take it from me, that's not the way to go. Putting your head in the sand when you don't understand something doesn't make the problem go away. And I think my biggest mistake was at the beginning having a personal account and making personal purchases as well as business purchases from the same account, and it created a bookkeeping nightmare. So especially if you're getting your business off the ground, hopefully this chat will help and sort of clear the waters and get you going in the right path. So before I start and introduce my guest, I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware that the following is presented for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. So if you have questions specific to your case, ask your accountant, and if you don't have one already, I'll be sharing my guest's contact information so you can email him after the show if you'd like to. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guest, CPA Nathan Owen. Nathan, thanks so much for joining me tonight. I know my viewers are really excited, especially for the Q&A at the end of the chat. Would you give my viewers a little brief biography about yourself?
Well, hi, Sarah. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, again, my name is Nathan Owen. I'm a certified public accountant here in Austin, Texas. I've been helping small businesses with their accounting since about 2001. I currently own and operate my own practice that focuses on bookkeeping and virtual CFO services, as well as tax for small to mid-sized businesses. I'm married to my beautiful wife, Erica, and we have two beautiful children. We have a gorgeous 3-year-old daughter, Lila, and a 1-year-old son, Ezra.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that biography. And I just wanted to remind everyone, please post your comments in the chat. Nathan will be answering some of your comments after we get through some topics, but please post your questions and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the second half of the chat. Okay, so Nathan, to start off, my first question is very basic, but when am I required to report my business income?
Well, that's a great question, Sarah, and like most accounting questions, the answer is always it depends. The IRS has a very loose definition of what constitutes income. According to the IRS, any amount could be considered income unless it's specifically exempted by law. And this even includes things like bartering or exchanging services. For instance, if I was to do your tax return and you paid me with some sewing patterns or bags, I would have to technically, according to the IRS, report the value of those bags as income to myself. And even when I took the CPA exam some years ago, they gave an example of someone just walking down the street and finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk. The IRS considers that income. Wow. That's how loose their definition is.
Okay,
so yeah, to your question though, everyone has a different situation, as you mentioned. But in general, if you're required to file a return, you're also required to report your business income, no matter what the amount is. if you're otherwise not required to file a return, the IRS says that you have to file if you made over $400 in self-employed income,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
So does that apply to both online sales and say if somebody were to sell bags at a craft fair, is it both online and in person?
Oh yeah, yeah, the total. If you're doing both, um, yeah, I think that there is a situation when you should not report your income, and that's if you're consistently having a loss from operations. For instance, if you're spending more to make your goods than you're making from selling them, if you report that loss year after year, the IRS has a right to go in and say, no, this isn't right. This is a hobby. This is not a business, and they can disqualify those losses. So I think it's important to be honest with yourself. Is this just a hobby or is this a legitimate business? Um, before you put it on a tax return.
Okay, that's a great point to make. Okay, jumping into my second question, do you need to create another business name or can you file under your actual name, for example, Sarah Lawson? And how should one be filing? Again, example, sole proprietor or something else?
Okay. Yeah, you don't need to create a business name in order to do business. You can perform all the work under your own name. If you'd like to get creative and have an interesting name, sometimes all you need is a DBA certificate, which just lets all the interested parties know that you're doing business under another name. Uh, if you're getting ready to go into business and you don't know how it's going to go, for instance, you don't know if you're going to make money in this business, being a sole proprietorship is a great way to test the waters. It doesn't require any upfront cost or paperwork. You could simply do a bunch of projects, go to a trade show, sell them for cash, you're in business. Um, of course, to your point, once your business gets going and you are making a profit, it might be time to consider other filing options. Um, Again, this is highly situational, but at the very minimum, I think you should consider organizing as an LLC just to afford yourself a little liability protection. Um, and there are some general guidelines that you can follow to picking the right entity for yourself. Um, Traditionally, when you're a sole proprietor or an LLC with a single member LLC, or even in a partnership, you're going to pay self-employment tax, which is 15.3% of your profit. And that catches a lot of new business owners off guard, especially if maybe you're married and your spouse has you already in a higher tax bracket. Then you're talking a large tax bracket on your income plus another 15.3%. It can really eat into your cash. Traditionally, the way to avoid the self-employment tax is to organize as an S corp, in which you are no longer self-employed, but instead an employee of the corporation. You have to pay yourself a W-2, which means that you have to pay payroll tax on that money. But the remaining amount of money that's not in your W-2 is no longer subject to that self-employment tax. I can give an example if you'd like.
Well, actually, I was going to share my
Yeah.
personal example of the DBA and all that. So, I
Yeah.
believe the first 2 years when I was in business, I was just operating under my own name. As Nathan mentioned, when you're starting a business, you're not sure how things will go. And um, for example, filing a DBA, I live in the state of Illinois. I believe that cost me $500. DBA stands for doing business as. And so my DBA name is So Sweetness. And so a new business, that's not a necessary step. You might want to just see how things go before you change over to a DBA. And in the example of the sole proprietor, I was a sole proprietor for, I believe, 3 or 4 years. And then after that, I changed to an S Corp, which is more technical. But as Nathan mentioned, then last year I was allowed to start paying myself a paycheck. So that's one of the main benefits of an S Corp. And I am also an LLC. And for those of you that are not familiar, an LLC is limited liability company. And it means, and correct me, Nathan, if I'm wrong, but it means that um, my own name and my business are two separate things. So, for example, if someone were to um, file a lawsuit against the business, my home, and since I'm married and I have children, that those things would be protected, and the business would be seen as a separate entity. So that's the difference between just having a business name and then the LLC. So I'm So Sweetness LLC, to be technical about it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, you're exactly right. All you're doing is affording yourself a little bit of separation between your personal assets and your business assets. Um, One new development, though, with this new tax law that's kind of changed the game a bit is that they're now allowing a 20% deduction on all your pass-through income, and that includes your net profit from being a single member LLC, being an S corp, being a partnership. Um, so whatever your net profit is, you get to take a flat 20% write off against that, um, which kind of changes the game a bit because in an S corp, we're splitting the total profit into what's your W-2 and what's considered pass-through income. And now under S corp, that amount is lower than it would have been if you were still a single member LLC. In most situations, the S corp is still going to be a better situation because saving that 15.3% tax is just so huge. But the margins are definitely smaller than they used to be. And again, there's so many complexities picking the right entity. But as long as you know the right questions to ask, you and your accountant should be able to determine the right entity for you.
Okay, so on to my third question. If you are taking care of the books yourself, and that means by books, it means like receipts and expenses, what program on the computer do you recommend, Excel or something else? And how often do you recommend adding receipts to the books? So maybe once a week, once a month, what would you suggest?
Okay. Um, well, as far as the software, I think this is similar to the previous question. When you're just getting started, Excel may be a fine way to keep records while you're just testing the waters and seeing if your business is going to be profitable. However, Excel is not an accounting system. So as soon as you start to have more numerous or more complex transactions, I'd recommend getting a true accounting software, QuickBooks. Um, the only thing I definitely is probably Quicken. It's more of a personal finance software. It's not an accounting software either. Um, how you add receipt books is going to depend on how organized you are and how many transactions you have. Usually, as my rule of thumb, I'd say add them before you forget what they were for.
Oh, yeah.
Say you purchase a lot of supplies and other things through vendors who use PayPal. You're not great at record keeping. You don't immediately print the receipt. Several months go by, and now it's time to organize your books for a tax return. You go back through your bank statements, and there are dozens of transactions that just read PayPal. How do you figure out what is what? So in those type of situations, timely record keeping can really help you. Can also help you with planning. Maybe you've spent too much, your account's nearly overdrawn. If you had recorded all your expenses on time in QuickBooks, you might have seen that coming. Or, maybe it's December and you haven't spent enough money and now you're going to owe on your taxes. It's time to spend some money. So, accurate and timely entries into your accounting system can tell you all this information.
Okay, so QuickBooks is the software that you would use and recommend?
I would recommend it for, most businesses, most small businesses.
Okay,
I
yeah,
know there's
and
also there's a lot of other ones, but
yeah, I use QuickBooks
that's
personally, and
there's also a huge support network for QuickBooks, so it makes it very easy to learn on your own. And you have a lot of other users out there who can help you.
okay. Is that on YouTube or is that where would the support
Oh
network
yeah,
be located?
YouTube forums. Intuit is the company that makes QuickBooks. They have a huge support community online where users answer other users' questions.
Okay,
Uh,
good to know. All right. My next question is, what can I claim as expenses? Can I claim fabric and supplies? What about a sewing machine and internet?
um, well, the IRS they have a concept. It's called economic substance. It basically means, does a transaction have economic weight, or more simply, does it have a legitimate business reason behind it. And it's up to you as the taxpayer to substantiate, provide proof that your transaction is legitimate. Um, so in general, yes, if you're in this type of industry, fabrics, supplies, small tools, anything related to the production of your income, those expenses are pretty easy to substantiate. Um, Traditionally, larger items like your sewing machine, computers, uh, they're usually considered fixed assets, and you have to depreciate them over time. But the IRS often considers smaller equipment, things under $2,500, to just be what they call de minimis. In other words, the amount's too insignificant to spend the time listing it out and depreciating. Uh, so, from a technical accounting perspective, large purchases for equipment need to be depreciated. But from a practical standpoint, even a really nice sewing machine could probably be expensed along with the other supplies. As far as internet, internet's usually considered a utility for your home, unless you have a separate office. So it would be, 100% deductible in a separate office. And if you're at your home, it should probably be included with your home office deduction. Um, some other popular deductions would be things like business mileage. Just make sure you keep a log of where you went and what the business reason was. Business use of your cell phone could be included too. The thing to remember though is that when you're an S corp, if you choose to go that route, you're no longer self-employed. You're an employee of the corporation. So things like your business mileage, cell phone, home office, if they're paid with personal funds, need to be treated differently. The best way to handle these types of transactions is to just document them and then have your company reimburse you. The reimbursement's deductible to the business and it's not taxable to you personally because it's a reimbursement check. Um, One other thing to consider with this new tax law update, meals and entertainment, such as taking client out to eat, no longer deductible at all. So um, I think the only meals you're allowed to deduct now are through traveling or if you're hosting a marketing event at your office or something like that.
So I had a sort of an add-on question when you mentioned mileage. So when
Yeah,
I first started deducting mileage, I was confused. You're not deducting the gas that you're putting into the car, you're actually deducting the cents per mile as listed on the government website. And to follow through with that, say somebody is driving to a craft fair, they're keeping track of the mileage and that's what they're expensing, not the gas.
that's correct. Yeah, the IRS gives a pretty generous allowance for business mileage. I think it's 53 and a half cents
Mm-hmm.
per mile now, um, which can really add up if you have a lot of mileage. And I feel like it's a lot easier to substantiate business mileage than to prove that your vehicle was 100% for business. That's often a lot harder to do. Typically, even realtors who have a lot of business mileage will still keep their vehicle in their personal name and not and just take the mileage rather than treating it as a business asset. Um, One other thing to consider between being a listing your vehicle as a business asset versus just doing the mileage deduction is that if it's a business asset and you sell it, technically you have to report the income as business income. And so a lot of people don't think about that when they want to list their vehicle. Oh, hey, now it belongs to the business. So when I sell it, it's business income.
Yeah, that's a good point. Piggybacking on that whole thing with the mileage, I use an app on my phone called Mile IQ, and basically it lets me swipe either right for business or left for personal, meaning what kind of drive it was. And if you're driving a lot, especially for teaching or craft fairs, you might want to investigate that app. I believe it was free up until a certain point, but after, I do pay a monthly fee, but it's well worth it because then I don't have to keep a notebook with all my miles that I'm driving. It's just in a monthly spreadsheet that I can print out and give to my accountant. Okay, so before we get on to my last question, I wanted to remind you and ask you to share, hit the share button if you're enjoying this chat, or if you think you might have some crafty friends that might find this information helpful. So just hit the share button if you're enjoying the chat. Okay, so one more question for me, and then we're going to get to all of your questions. Nathan will be answering some questions live. What is involved in filing taxes, and how do you find an accountant?
Uh, uh, well, depending on the complexity of your business and your transactions, filing your taxes can be, very simple or, very difficult. There are a few software packages out there, besides TurboTax, of course. Credit Karma is one, lets you file your taxes for free. Again, TurboTax also very popular. It does cost more if you add a Schedule C for your business. Um, if you have a separate business entity like a partnership or an S corp that requires a return of its own, most of these types of returns are not really in the realm of TurboTax type softwares. You should consider engaging an accountant. Um, but when it comes to preparing your books or having an accountant do them, just consider how much time it takes and if that time could be better utilized elsewhere. Um, I mean, I assume that when you started your business, Sarah, you probably didn't think, oh, I'm going to need to dedicate several hours a week to entering receipts into QuickBooks.
Yeah.
And, most small business owners are passionate about their business and probably should focus on what they do well. If keeping track of your own records is becoming too much of a chore, or if you're confused if you're doing it correctly, accountants can help, often at a reasonable rate, hourly or monthly.
Yeah, so I'm a really big fan of bootstrapping. Everything that I do with my business, I do it myself until it's sort of no longer in the realm of the time that I have available. And I didn't always have a bookkeeper, but I currently do have a bookkeeper that does my books every month. But even a couple years ago, I couldn't fathom that spending that expense to have somebody else do it. So at one time, I certainly did everything myself, but that's great advice to seek out the help that you need if you need it and when you can afford it. So I'm going to put up a graphic for Nathan's website up on the screen right now. His contact information is up at the website, and after the chat, if you have any questions or would like to hire him as an accountant, you can go visit his website and contact him through there. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to answering some of your questions live. So we're going to put some up on the screen. I'm going to read them, and Nathan's going to answer some of these questions. Okay, so the first question is, if you have been filing as a business for 1 or 2 years, and year 3 you decide the business isn't working out, do you have to do anything in anything special in year 3? And that's from Terry.
That's a good question. Sort of back to what I was talking about with the hobby losses. If you were filing at a loss for the first 2 years, I would say year 3 you probably don't want to file the business portion of the income. There's always other things you can do, little tricks. For instance, if you wanted to stick with this as a business and you felt sure that it was going to work out, you could always just not deduct all of your expenses. You could put some of those supplies in inventory and not deduct them during that year and sort of force your company to show a profit. But yeah, again, you should be honest with yourself and really decide, hey, is this a legitimate business or am I just doing this as a hobby?
Is
Does
there
that
any
answer your
special
question?
paperwork that needs to be filed in year 3 that says you're not going to continue on with filing for the
No,
business, or no? Okay.
no. If there was ever an audit, you could just say, hey, I determined that this was going to be a hobby loss, and so I did not file this income because it was at a loss.
Okay.
But yeah, usually they wouldn't question it unless there was a 1099.
Okay. Nika wants to know, Nathan, are any of your clients sole proprietors who file self-employment income on their 1040?
Yes, that's the easy question. I do have some realtor clients, an attorney, mostly professionals uh, who have pretty simple self-employment
Okay.
type of income. My other clients that are have more complex businesses or Good.
Before we get to Pat's question, you mentioned something to me before the chat about
Hmm.
a lawyer that you knew that was preparing taxes for a friend and it wasn't his
Yeah.
area. I just wanted to make that a point. Nathan said about trusting family and friends.
Yeah. Family, friends, neighbors, they can be great, but consider where the advice is coming from, and are they an expert in their field? The CPA exam is no joke. It takes a long time, and it's a huge amount of information. And a lot of people who don't do this for a living can't see all the angles. There are so many rules and exceptions to the rule, and even exceptions to the exception to the rule, that it's probably impossible to have someone who does this on a amateur basis, or just does one or two returns a year to understand all of those rules completely.
Okay. All right. All right. So let's put Pat's question back up on the screen. Pat wanted to know
Yeah.
what is pass-through income?
Well, if you have a business, pass-through income is income in the business that is not taxed at the corporate level. In other words, if it was a C corp, that money is taxed at the business level. But if not, it passes through to you, and you pay it on a personal level. In other words, you'd receive a form at the end of the year that would show this is my share of the income through this business, and I'm going to pay it at my personal rate. That's what they're considering pass through income.
Okay. Addie wants to know if it hasn't already been discussed, when does a hobby become a business? Is there an income threshold for it?
Yeah, the IRS says $400 as when you need to report your business income. Um,
Okay, so anything
but
over
when
400
it
then.
be, yeah,
Okay.
I'd love it if all of our hobbies could make money. I have plenty of hobbies that don't.
Kathy wants to know I recently machine embroidered some items for a business to sell. I I was maybe paid 250 dollars. Do I have to report as income to the IRS?
If you're that's under the $400, but if you're required to file a return otherwise, say you had a W-2 that was over, you know, ten, $11,000, whatever the exact number is, then yeah, you should report it.
Okay, so when you said 10 or 11,000, that might mean from a job or a part-time job, independent
Yeah,
of the
there's
embroidery.
you can do a quick Google search and just write, "Am I required to file a return?" And the IRS has a very simple guide that says if I'm single, if I'm married, how much money do I have to make in order to be
Okay.
required to file a return. So
Okay.
if you're required to file a return under those rules, then you should be reporting the $250.
Okay. That sounds pretty
If
easy to
if you're
figure out.
not required under those rules, then it would have to be over $400 for you to file a return.
Okay. Got
So
it. Mary wants to know
I
if I
know. See,
sell a
there's
few.
lots of
Sorry.
exceptions to the exception. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
That's
Mary wanted to know if I sell a few items online and at craft fairs, am I required to collect sales tax and report income? Yeah, that's a really good question. Is she required to collect the tax from her customers?
yeah, that's a state by state question though.
Okay.
In Texas, typically yes, you're required to collect sales tax um, when you're selling items. Usually, services in most states aren't taxable, but again, it differs a lot from state to state. I'm sorry, I don't
No,
have
that's
a more
okay.
exact
Well,
answer.
I'm in Illinois and I do have to report and collect sales tax from my in-person sales within Illinois and online if somebody in Illinois purchases a physical item. And I know I'm in a group with other pattern designers. A lot of us travel to other states to teach. And if, again, depending on the state, if you're selling merchandise in another state, depending on their laws, you might need to collect and file the taxes with that state, even though you live in a different one. Okay, Empress Noel wants to know how do you handle charitable donations such as quilts for charity recipients?
That's a pretty complex question, actually. That might be a good one to email me. It's going to heavily depend on, where did the quilt come from? Did you have a business making quilts? Um, did you already deduct the expenses of making the quilt before? Um, you know, is it a highly valued quilt that's going to be need an appraisal? There's a lot of circumstances to that question.
I
Sorry.
see. Yeah, Empress
That
Noel, feel free to go to
Empress
Nathan's
Noel,
website and
yeah,
contact
that'd be
him
a
through
great
there.
one to
Yeah.
email me.
Barbara Ann wanted to
Okay.
know, I just started selling my handbags at craft shows. I keep all my receipts and keep track of my time. Is there an easy way to set up in the computer?
Um, Keeping track of your time. I'm not sure.
I think she
I
means
mean, probably
maybe
the
what her hourly wage would be, but I'm guessing that doesn't come into play with expensing
if you're
fabric or.
self-employed, yeah, you're not going to be able to deduct your time.
I think the time would be
But
more appropriate to pricing the item for sale, so I don't
oh,
think
gotcha.
necessarily the time would go into the books.
Yeah, I'd say probably just Excel would be the easiest way to organize them, or invest in QuickBooks. QuickBooks Online, I think they offer for a brand new business, it's like $10 a month to get
Okay,
started. It's very simple.
that's pretty affordable.
Yeah.
Lynn wanted to know, does pass-through income pertain to S corps and LLCs, or does it only pertain to sole proprietorships?
It applies to all of those S corps, LLCs, sole proprietors. I think they're still working on the definition. If it's going to apply to sole proprietors, it would not apply to a C corp. Would be the only one for sure.
Okay. All right. Joy wanted to know, when should you become an LLC?
Well, that's a good attorney question actually. But I would say in general, if you felt that there was um, a legal reason why you'd want to be protected, maybe you have more exposure, you're doing more business, you're definitely wanting to separate. Whenever you feel like it's appropriate to separate your personal name from your business activities, that's when it's a great time to become an LLC.
I think maybe an example that I could give would be people who make softies or stuffed animals with sewn in eyes or noses or different parts that might come off and a child might choke on them. That might be a good example when somebody should become an LLC. What do you think, Nathan?
Oh yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, I'd say
All
in this
right.
day and age, even if you put something with a zipper on it, you might want to consider taking some kind of legal protection.
Susan wanted to
Okay.
know, where do I get a list of deductions I can take for a sole proprietor?
Um, that's a pretty good question. I'd say probably the best source would be to look at a Schedule C on your tax return. It has a list of preset deductions right there. Google's also a good resource for uh, lots of more of the uncommon deductions you might not know about.
Joanne asked, what is the frequency for making tax payments?
Um, According to the IRS, you should be making it quarterly. Quarterly tax payments is the requirement.
Okay, yeah, I make mine quarterly as well. At one time, I did make once a year payments, but I feel like the quarterly payments are easier to manage, and then at least I always knew I had the money in the account because they were smaller amounts.
Yeah, and
Christine,
there are
oh, sorry.
tax forms that yeah. Usually, if you file your return, sometimes they'll print out pre-made forms that say to pay in this much each quarter once you get your business going.
Christine asked, does an LLC expire?
Um, that's probably another because an LLC is an entity that's recognized by the state and uh, by the federal government, and a lot of states have rules to keep your LLC going. Here in Texas, we have to pay yearly. franchise tax in order to keep the LLC active. And I'm not sure. That's another state by state question.
Okay. Yeah, in Illinois, I believe I'm renewing mine once a year and paying a fee for that
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. Beth asked, what do you think about using LegalZoom to set up an LLC or S Corp?
I think that's LegalZoom would be fine. If it's just by yourself, though, I think if you're at all considering a partner or having multiple members in your LLC, or multiple shareholders in your S corp, you really should talk to an attorney and make sure you get all those things ironed out beforehand in some sort of partnership agreement, uh, just to save yourself a lot of heartache later in life.
Okay, Kelly says, I have a full time job. I'm a few years away from early retirement, and I'm trying to start up a small business to jump in with both feet when I retire. I don't expect a profit this year, but I do have an LLC and a tax ID.
You have to begin filing now.
Do I have to begin filing now?
Um, if you don't expect a profit this year, I'm not sure if you made some income, you may need to go ahead and file. If you didn't have any income, if you just had the expenses, you can always just save those for the next year to write them off against income.
Patricia asked, how do you know if you are working with a knowledgeable accountant, and how do you choose when to work with?
That is a great question. um, wow, that's probably the best question I've seen tonight. Uh, how do you know if you're going to work with a knowledgeable accountant? I think that probably the best thing to do is to be familiar yourself. It doesn't require an accounting degree to learn the basics. You can find a lot of helpful videos on YouTube or Google and just learn the basics of accounting and the treatment of very common transactions, such as I just heard a story today about a bookkeeper who was um, classifying equity draws incorrectly for a small business owner. And that seems like something that would be easy to catch for even the owner to understand that was incorrectly done. So, try to just do your research and be knowledgeable, and you know, uh, you don't have to know all of the circumstances, but you can probably get a good feel for your CPA and to see if they're doing a good job.
Like, is asking for references or anything like that appropriate, or?
Yeah, I mean, you could ask for references. Maybe someone even in your same industry if possible.
Mhm.
I think some CPAs are probably more guarded about their client list than others. Bookkeepers in general aren't. They're happy to share their client list and who they do business with. Um, but yeah, that's
So maybe word of
you know,
mouth, maybe seek somebody out
word of mouth can
who
be great.
is in a similar position or a position you want to be in, and ask who does their books. That might be a good way to go about it.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Olga wanted to know, there are CPA services on the internet. Do you recommend using them?
That's going to be also situational. I think that, I just heard someone tell me that they had their tax returns done in the Philippines and, very cheaply done. And I was like, wow, great for them. They saved a lot of money rather than having a CPA here in the States do them. But, think about what sort of audit protection are you going to get through that? Um, what kind of reassurance are you going to have that that was done correctly? Uh, it, if you have a very simple return, very simple accounting, it might be worth taking the risk of doing it online. Um, but yeah, most people, when they're trusting somebody with their personal financial information, they usually want to put a face
Hmm.
to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense. Lawanda asked, do I need a business license? I want to sell at craft fairs and one-on-one.
Um, a business license. I think you might mean a sales tax permit, but you don't need a business license to go into business. No, you can just say, I have these for sale, uh, and now you're a sole proprietor. Um,
Okay, but a sale tax
But yeah,
license.
sales tax permit probably.
Okay, got it. Joy asks, when should you start using a CPA versus a person? Maybe she means
Tax person
accountant.
is like a H&R Block or uh, there's also enrolled agents, which are not CPAs, but they're people that are allowed to file with the IRS for you. And I actually know some very talented enrolled agents that know a lot about tax. So it might be a similar question uh, to the previous one about how to find a good accountant, word of mouth. Um, I would say that as your business grows and gets more complex, you may need the extra expertise, and that's when I would consider going with the CPA.
Okay, over like H&R Block or
Oh yeah,
yeah. Okay.
yeah, and sometimes it even can be cheaper in some situations. I know a lot of those places charge by the form. So if you have maybe multiple Schedule Cs or you have multiple, rental properties or other forms that are going to be on your tax return, sometimes it can be cheaper to go with someone who just charges by the hour.
Okay, interesting. Kathy asks, can you deduct a sewing machine even if you had the machine prior to starting the business, or would it be equity only or capital?
um, I'd probably say it depends on how long ago you purchased it. If you have a receipt for it, and you can say that you are contributing it to the business. I don't know if you could contribute something that was, your grandmother's that was passed down to you. But if you bought it within the last few years, I'm sure you could
Okay.
still say, "Hey, I'm contributing this." I did the same thing with. I had a laptop. I contributed to my own business that I purchased prior to forming the company.
Okay, but say having the receipt is important to being able to do that?
Yes,
Okay.
probably. You want to have some kind of substantiation for it.
Okay. Natalie asked, can husband and wife be sole proprietorship?
Yes. But usually, when you put together when you're filing for your sole proprietorship on your Schedule C, it's going to ask, is this Schedule C owned by the husband, the wife, or joint? And that's important because the money you pay for your self-employment tax actually goes towards your overall Social Security and Medicare. It's almost like paying into Social Security.
Okay.
And there have been people that said, "Hey, my husband was self-employed, for 40 years. He always just filed under his name. Now I don't have any Social Security under my name." So,
Okay.
be careful with how you're filing that. Um,
Okay, Susan asked, do I need to have a DBA if not using my name along with tax ID?
um, yeah, I would say that if you're the important thing about DBA is how are you getting paid? If you're getting paid under So Sweetness, if someone wrote you a check for So Sweetness,
Mm-hmm.
you would need a DBA under So Sweetness. If you just have a sign up that says So Sweetness, but you're taking all your checks as Sarah Lawson, then you don't need the DBA.
Okay, that makes sense. So if
That's
one was at the
easy.
craft fair and they had a sign on their table, so sweetness, the check should be made out to Sarah Lawson without the
Yeah,
DBA. Okay, that makes
yeah. So
sense.
no DBA needed.
All right, let's see if there's any more questions coming through. This one's funny. Empress Noel says, what is the best way to present my stuff to the CPA? Shoebox okay or best method?
Yeah, that might be a quick way to get kicked out of a CPA's office if you bring a shoebox full of receipts. Um, as organized as you can be, I would say is the best route. If you want to present the shoebox full of receipts, I'd probably include a spreadsheet that organizes them into categories as well.
Okay. Okay. Karen wants to know if I make a quote for someone and just have them reimburse me for materials costs, does that count as income?
Um, I think technically I would say that does, but I mean you would end up paying a net zero for your tax. If you're just doing it as a one-time thing, I'd probably say it's not worth it to create a business. If this is something you do over and over, it would probably still be considered a hobby because you're not making any money from it. You're just coming out to a net zero.
Okay. Christine says, I have purchased a lot of sewing equipment this year with plans of earning money with it starting next year. Can I deduct these expenses this year, or do I need to wait until I am earning money using the equipment?
You can start deducting it this year. Again, you might want to be if you want to play it safe, you could wait till next year, and so that way, you again you want to save on the self-employment tax too. So I'd rather have the deductions to reduce that self-employment tax rather than taking it against nothing.
Okay. Lawanda wants to know, is the sales tax permit the same as a tax ID?
No, the tax ID is going to be a federal thing you get from the IRS. Sales tax is going to be a state level thing. Here in Texas, I filed for my LLC on the state level, and I don't pay sales tax because I'm a service. But I would have paid. I would have also filed for a sales tax permit at the same time with Texas. Um, the tax ID is something you send off for the IRS, and they actually have a pretty handy website to get your tax ID number from.
Okay, so this is a long question. The whole question won't be
Okay.
on the screen, but I'm going to read it all out. Joan wants to know, I moved my long arm into a studio. Uh, for Nathan's reference, a long arm is a piece of equipment, sewing equipment. I moved my long arm into a studio and ended up with my first ever loss after 6 years in business. Um, Expenses and health issues overwhelmed me. Will this be an issue going forward? I am moving back home and my lease is up. In the past, I didn't deduct for business space in my home as it was a multi-use space. So she wants to know about the loss after 6 years in business, if that will be an issue for the coming years.
No, if you've had 5 good years of filing with a profit, the IRS is not going to hold it against you that you had, 1 year of a loss. They usually look at it in 3 year increments. So if you start to have a loss in the following 2 or 3 years, they might start looking at it. Um, but again, since you've established that you can make money from this, you've established that it is a legitimate business. Um, there's no reason to be scared that it's going to be a hobby or deemed a hobby later. To answer the question about the home office, she's exactly right. If it's mixed use, it's not considered home office. The IRS would definitely disallow that. For anyone who's considering a home office or maybe creating a studio, um, the IRS definitely wants to see that that is solely for business and not mixed use space. So don't do your bedroom, don't do the kitchen.
Yeah,
Make sure it's a dedicated room.
okay. That makes a lot of sense. Um, oh, Karen has a good question.
Alrighty.
Can you recommend any books that we could read about starting and maintaining a personal business?
Um, I don't have any in particular on the top of my head, at least not for this industry. I have some about construction I could recommend
Well, I have
if
some
you want to
good
become a home builder.
marketing related books. I read a lot of marketing, and I'm also a big fan of Shark Tank. So Gary Vaynerchuk just came out with a new book today. It's called Crushing It, and I have all of his other books. Um, there's another book called Friction that I'm a fan of, and I pretty much read all of the uh, Shark Tank people, all of their books. Mark Cuban, Damon John, I have their books, so those are good books as well. I don't have any to recommend as far as bookkeeping, but those are just some of my marketing favorites. Okay, let's see if
Yeah,
there's.
again, there are so many resources nowadays, especially online. You could pick up the basics just from Googling or going onto YouTube and searching for the right type of topics. There's lots of help out there.
And I also wanted to mention the website, Craft Industry Alliance. It's a great craft specific organization, so not just sewing, but knitting, and other things. And there's a lot of business related advice on that website. So again, that's Craft Industry Alliance. Okay. I think this might be a state specific question, but Bethany wanted to know, I sell consignment in Missouri, but a branch of the store is on the Kansas side. Can I sell consignment on the Kansas side with a Missouri license?
Oh yeah, that's definitely going to be a
State specific.
Kansas City CPA question. That was a great one that you should probably look for a CPA to help you with that.
Okay.
My dad is actually from Kansas City, so great question. Either way.
Beth wants to know, I currently have a sewing room for all my quilt craft making. Would I be able to claim this room as a business space even if I make my personal items in this room as well?
I would say probably if it's mostly for business, um, and it's for the you're not using it as like a guest room or some other function of the room, then I would say that's probably pretty safe to use it as business. You want to be careful, especially with things like garages, like converted garages and attic space, things like that, because you're going to need to list out how much square footage your business space is versus the overall square footage of the house. Well, traditionally, attic space and garage space is not included in the total square footage of the house. So make sure you add that on if you converted your garage, for instance. My house, I could say it's 1,900 square feet and I'm using 200 square feet of my garage. Well, I didn't include the 200 square feet in the house. So I would need to change that to 200 square feet of 2,100 rather than 1,900.
Okay. All right. So I think we've been on for almost an hour. I think we're going to wrap up. We tried to get to as many questions as we could, but we're going to put up Nathan's website again on the screen for your reference. If you'd like to hire him, he's available for bookkeeping as well as accounting. So go to his website and his contact information will be there. Thanks again so much to Nathan Owen for joining us tonight and answering all these questions. I know everyone had some great questions, so thanks again for joining me. I really appreciate it. And
Yeah, thanks.
thanks to all of you for watching tonight. And if you missed the live version or if you jumped in the middle, the recording of this chat will always be available on YouTube and Facebook. That's at So Sweetness. And I'm Sarah Lawson. I'll see you again next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central Time for Ask Sarah.